Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful contribution from Pao describing the spiritual beings present in Hmong sacred landscapes in Laos. So we're going to move on to the next presentation by David Hecht. And David has prepared his presentation in partnership with one of his most important field partners in Bhutan, Gyampo Wangchuk. So David is a environmental anthropologist, and he completed his PhD at the University of Georgia a few years ago in integrative conservation and anthropology. He did his doctoral research in partnership with the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature, which is one of the oldest conservation nonprofits in Bhutan. And David has worked for many years in Bhutan in close collaboration with local communities, primarily doing collaborative conservation projects focused on endangered bird species, mainly cranes and herons. And he also has done a lot of participatory mapping. So he's very interested in the sacred landscapes that are found throughout the Kingdom of Bhutan. And that is the focus of the presentation he's created for us today. It's also worth mentioning that he's a National Geographic explorer. So let's have a look at David's video.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this wonderful symposium on navigating heritage-sensitive conservation policy in Indo-Burma and South Asia. My name is David Hecht, and I'm a cultural and environmental anthropologist whose work in Bhutan explores how lived religious practices, landscape ontologies, and conservation policy intersect in complex and sometimes conflicting ways. Today, rather than focusing on method or theory, I want to humbly share a few reflections from my doctoral research on cosmopolitical ecologies in Bhutan and how these conversations might contribute to a broader discussion about the ethical, political, and representational challenges of weaving indigenous and local knowledge systems into conservation governance. In exploring more representational and relational ways in which land, place, and territory are experienced and governed, I interrogate map making and maps, recognizing their long history, wielding power as tools of claiming territory. As with knowledge, all maps are inherently situated, partial, perspectival, and political, regardless of their normative use in conservation practice as more positivist, objective spatial authorities and technologies of visualization. Concurrently, maps have also been used to challenge dominant narratives, depicting different realities and worlds by privileging some information over others. The questions I've found most compelling in this regard is whose worlds are included or indeed rendered visible on the map in conservation arenas. And I'm here today to highlight our work as a grounded example of some of the cosmopolitical frictions between local and international environmental governance norms in conservation practice. In Bhutan, the landscape is inspirited with relations, both tangible and intangible. Hillsides, rivers, and forests are home not only to wildlife, but to powerful beings, Yula, Jida, Lu, Tsen, territorial deities and spirits who govern, protect, and sometimes punish in resistance to ecological disturbance and moral transgressions. These more than human presences are part of the cultural and ecological fabric of community life. They are propitiated through annual rituals that sustain balance between human and non-human worlds. Yet, as in much of Asia, international, state, and community perspectives on these same landscapes often diverge. For many Bhutanese, landscapes are very storied territories animated by spirits and deities whose presence defines the ethical parameters of land use. And for conservation and development authorities, land is also categorized by spatial units of governance, such as protected areas or community forests, hydropower corridors, and administrative boundaries. Our work traces how these two systems, both sort of more of a place-based spiritual ecology and a geopolitical bureaucratic ecology, collide and sometimes collaborate in practice. This disconnect, as our group is discussing in this symposium, reflects a broader tension across the region between relational, place-based ways of knowing and policy frameworks premised on fixed categories such as nature, heritage, sacred site, or even indigenous people. Even when states acknowledge sacred or cultural sites, the criteria used to define and map them can exclude the very ontologies that make them meaningful. In my work, this becomes particularly clear in conservation programs for focal wildlife species, who are commonly centered in well-funded conservation campaigns, such as those for the black-necked crane, a migratory bird revered as an auspicious messenger, particularly in Bhutan's high-altitude valleys. And for decades, conservation NGOs and the royal government have protected the crane's wintering wetlands, designated as Ramsar sites and national conservation areas. Yet, for the communities who live there, these wetlands and the surrounding forested hillsides are not only ecological habitats important for cranes, they're also the abodes of powerful local deities. Territories in the hills and forests surrounding them are known as podrong, or the citadel of the deity, where certain acts such as tree cutting, road building, or even loud noise can anger these unseen beings and bring about community misfortune. When I began fieldwork in these places, I joined Bhutan's oldest conservation NGO, the Royal Society for the Protection of Nature. And together we worked with communities to better understand how people perceive and manage their environments, both the visible, tangible dimensions and the invisible, intangible ones. Through participatory mapping sessions and focal group discussions, oral histories, and long evenings of storytelling, local partners drew maps of their valleys, showing the houses, temples, rivers, and forests they knew so intimately. As participants narrated their maps, other geographies began to appear. Mountain peaks inhabited by Yula, springs guarded by Tsomen or Lu, cliffside dwellings of Tsen, and old-growth trees that serve as the thrones for protective deities. Oftentimes frictions that emerge in daily life. For instance, one participant explained that when a road construction crew cut too close to a local deity's podrong, the machine driver fell mysteriously ill until the local lama performed a ritual to appease the offended spirit. Another described how powerful deities often punished those who disturbed their domains, but now seemed weakened, their power reduced, as the forest is fragmented by important NRDC development initiatives. Such accounts express more than just a more than human presence. They reveal cosmopolitical ecologies, resilience, and resistance that cannot be ignored or sidelined at the decision-making table. They also illuminate ongoing negotiations over what knowledge counts as legitimate authority in governing land and whose worlds are included or not in the politics of representation in Bhutan. In our participatory mapping sessions, these storied reflections complicate the notion of sacred natural sites as discrete, mappable entities. In practice, sacredness in Bhutan is not intermittently distributed across the landscape, but indeed pervasive, woven through relationships among humans, deities, animals, religious histories, within every footstep. In a global framework, even if conservation and development planners asked communities to identify specific sacred sites for protection, this imposes a logic of boundedness that does not necessarily fit the lived relational cosmologies of these communal landscapes. Participatory mapping helped make this friction visible, as mapping in any form comes with a sort of a quality of spatial and temporal fixing. As local participants added names of deities to our hand-woven maps, hand-drawn maps, and described their territories, it became clear that nearly every ridge, stream, or forest was inhabited and inscribed by more than human worlds. And the act of community mapping prompted deeper conversations about ritual obligations, social responsibility towards the land, conversations that might never have occurred in a formal policy consultation. It also complicated the notion of boundaries and even mappability of features, if they were documented vis-a-vis Western cartographic rules and assumptions. And at the same time, translating these relational worlds into cartographic form raised certain ethical dilemmas. How could we map beings that are named, known, even relationally experienced, but are also intangible, oftentimes unruly, wielding their own agency? How could we avoid reducing complex ontologies into data points, pixels, and polygons? And these are not trivial or easy questions to navigate, because they also speak to the politics of translation and representation that underlie even well-intentioned participatory research. In response, my collaborators and I began in some ways experimenting with what we came to understand in this context as mapping otherwise, in a way that was centered on deep listening and heightened relational awareness of place and space through time. We worked in partnership with local artist Gyempo Wangchuk to paint a series of paintings inspired by Tanka and debris mural traditions. Instead of looking down from a satellite's eye, these paintings adopt a first-person oblique perspective, how the landscape appears from within, or even from the mountaintop abode of the Yula. It's a world of many worlds coexisting in a layered visual space. Each painting corresponds to a conservation landscape for the black-necked crane in this case, rendered both topographically accurate and culturally, contextually resonant. They were co-produced through years of consultation with community elders, religious authorities, spiritual mediums, and conservation practitioners, referencing oral histories and ritual texts that describe the deity's domain. And in these visualizations, cranes and community members share the valley and forests with unseen custodians and the original owners of the land. Our mapping practice is not at all meant to replace GIS mapping or any sort of geospatial modeling in the conservation policy sector, but to open a dialogue between worlds with participatory mapping as a site of epistemic negotiation, to imagine how multiple worlds might coexist within the same landscape representation. It also invites policy audiences to consider, what if conservation maps were not only biophysical but cosmological domains? What might heritage-sensitive policy look like if it fully recognized what local communities already know, and the very diverse cultural geographies through which communities inhabit their environments? Indeed, there are no neutral brush strokes in these paintings, and 1,000 different collaborative decisions were made to address issues of scale, agency, power, perspective, as well as positionality. For instance, in these paintings, scale of objects is both a matter of sort of spatial and topographical distance, as well as cultural and historical importance. We also recognize the agency of local deities within and sometimes between their territories by depicting them on a traditional cloud motif. A directional compass was also set and designed as a traditional mandala with a rainbow border, which the artist painted intentionally as an invitation to the viewer to understand the painting's complexities and lean inward. We also noted, internationally recognized conservation areas for cranes, such as the Ramsar site in Gangte, and we also ensured that all of the paintings had traditional offerings made for the local deities depicted, as well as revered teachers whose historical presence was a really important dimension. This case illuminates broader regional questions across South and Southeast Asia. The politics of recognition. How can we recognize community that involves more than human relations? What counts as local or indigenous knowledge, and what forms of knowledge count as credible? All of this shapes how focal landscapes are governed. International frameworks like UNDRIP or even ILO 169 presume definitions of indigeneity grounded in colonial histories or spatial permanence. Yet in never colonized contexts such as Bhutan or Thailand, these definitions can obscure the relational identities of highland and ethnic minority and majority communities. Moreover, when foreign authorities attempt to integrate cultural heritage or spiritual values into conservation planning, they often do so through more bureaucratic instruments that require standardization and verification. The result is more of a narrowing of what places can mean and be, turning fluid relational worlds into more static heritage objects. Well, our task then is not only to document these local spatial and relational worlds, but to question the epistemic infrastructure that makes certain worlds legible to policy while excluding others. The challenge is ethical as well as technical, how to engage with beings, human and non-human, that resist conventional representation, how to honor intergenerational communities' sensitivities and relational histories around naming and visualization, and how to translate these complexities into customary governance frameworks without collapsing them. I believe Bhutan offers an instructive example for this broader inquiry. Despite its small size, the country has long experimented with successful alternative governance models, community forestry efforts, and cultural preservation as a constitutional mandate, foregrounding spiritual well-being. Yet, even here, conservation remains largely framed through the language of more ecological wildlife sciences and geopolitical territoriality. Local deities, though widely acknowledged in daily life and even any infrastructure development, seldom appear in official environmental policy. The friction between these parallel systems reveals both the promise and the limits of a more heritage-sensitive conservation approach or initiative. And through this process of our more hyper context-specific mapping otherwise, our team sought to render visible not just in cartographic form, but in conversation, the cosmopolitical dimensions of landscape governance. How decisions about land, water, and forests are always already negotiations among many kinds of beings, and stewarded by the communities that are foregrounded or championed in community-based models. So these paintings that we were alluding to will be shared in partnership with the communities whose knowledge is integrated in every brushstroke. And next year we are planning to host an exhibit here at the Wangdu Choling Palace Museum and Cultural Center in Bhutan, in partnership with RSPN, the Bhutan Foundation, and other institutions to open discussions on how local ways of knowing and being in the world might inform contemporary conservation practice. In conclusion, I want to return to the larger aim of this symposium, to build convergence across efforts that highlight practical and challenges in reconciling spiritual landscapes with policy frameworks. From this case, a few concluding insights emerged for me. First, this idea of quote-unquote sacredness is an imperfect categorization of the more than human intersections that are relational and pervasive, rarely spatially bounded in the discrete ways that are oftentimes alluded to in more normative maps. Policies that seek to designate or delimit sacred sites risk misunderstanding the ontological basis of these more spiritual ecologies. And importantly, mapping and spatial documentation are also never neutral, right? They are political acts that privilege certain forms of knowledge over others, prompting the critical importance of researcher reflexivity, co-production, and design of research. To work toward heritage-sensitive governance, we must also reimagine the representational tools through which heritage becomes visible. And finally, perhaps most importantly, at least from my own vantage point, is the recognition of the diversity of cosmopolitical ecologies and worlds in which deities, humans, and other beings are co-present. It requires a certain degree of epistemological humility, right? It asks policymakers, researchers, and practitioners to move beyond inclusion toward more genuine coexistence of our worlds, and ensuring that we live in a world in which many worlds fit. The hope is not at all to universalize a model from any one place, but to contribute to a broader conversation about what more relational and pluralistic conservation might manifest in what conservation policy might look like, in the way in which maps are created, in which policies across Asia's spiritual landscapes, where the land is both habitat and home, archive and ancestor, ecosystem and more than human relation. And with that, I want to thank everyone for their time, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions that follow. Thanks all.